Welcome back to Get Down to Business, the show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship. Boy, do I have a treat in store for you. You've heard of Franklin Covey because they have enabled companies to achieve greatness by developing exceptional leaders at every level. That's why I'm super excited to be joined by Curtis Bateman, Franklin Covey's Vice President of International Offices, to talk about something that's really, really important, the 3 C's, change, culture, and communication. Curtis, you're very passionate about those 3 C's, and I'm thrilled to have you on. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Shalom. I am passionate about those 3 C's. I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Absolutely. So let's start right there. How did you become passionate? Why are you so passionate about those 3 C's? Tell us a little bit about your background and where it's led to these 3 C's.
Yeah, that's good. So I started my career early on in technology, which created a lot of change, and it introduced me to a lot of different companies. So I started to see culture show up as well. And then I had a really rare privilege to work with Dr. Spencer Johnson, the author of Who Moved My Cheese, for about 10 years on change. And that set the course. It got me into the space working on these 3 C's with a really strong emphasis on the change C. And I love it. I've been working on it for over 20 years now.
Oh, yeah. So again, Curtis, I'm really glad to have you on over here. And can you walk us through the process of that C, that change, the process of change? What contributes to successfully getting through change, especially relevant to our entrepreneurs that are tuning in today?
Yeah, good question. So there's a predictable pattern that we uncovered that will feel largely familiar to people, but there's just 4 zones. There's the zone of status quo. That's life before a change is introduced. And then there's this space right after a change is introduced, which I call the zone of disruption. And that feels highly uncertain, unstable. People are struggling to understand what's changing, why is it changing, and what does it mean to them. And that has a big impact on outcomes for people, teams, and organizations. We work with people to get through that space across what we call the point of decision and start the process of actually implementing the change, which we call the zone of adoption. We'd all love it to be fast and furious and easy, and it's usually more like a bowl of spaghetti with backwards and forwards and stops and starts. And then over time, the reason we make the change is to get something better, an outcome that's better. And when we move into that 4th zone, we get into what we call the zone of innovation, which is where all the benefit and the outcomes of the change tend to materialize. What's funny is a lot of people stop short of that because they get so tired and fatigued of it, but there's a real opportunity to make it all the way into that 4th zone and really derive a lot of benefit from making changes, both personally and professionally.
Again, chatting with Curtis Bateman, Franklin Covey's Vice President of International Offices. We're chatting all about meeting those challenges and building upon it with a focus on 3 challenge areas that matter the most, the 3 C's, change, culture, and communication. So we've spent the first few minutes talking about change. I want to talk a little bit about culture. What would you say, Curtis, are the questions that a leader or an organization should ask themselves in revealing their company's culture, even if it might just be, a smaller organization just getting started?
Yeah, every organization has a culture. The real question is whether we're intentional about it, whether we're trying to define and create a culture that matches our organization and our values. And so often leaders allow culture to just materialize without intentionality. And there's so much opportunity here. The biggest and most expensive resource most organizations have is their people. And if leaders will be deliberate about defining a culture, they can find that it will create more alignment, more engagement, higher retention, all of the things that we want as leaders from our people. But we have to be intentional about it. And so many leaders just aren't.
Absolutely. So we've chatted a little bit about the change, a little bit about the culture. I do want to spend a couple of minutes talking about communication, which I know is the other important part of those 3 C's. Can you give us an example of a conversation balance between courage and consideration? You talk a lot about that on many shows that I've seen you on.
Yeah, those are both so important. I suppose it's even important to step back and say, communication is an essential leadership capability. And sometimes that communication is listening. Sometimes it's talking. And we need to be careful that communication is a dialogue, not a monologue. And that's hard for leaders, especially if we don't feel confident in what we're doing. We might tend to just talk to fill the space. Or if we don't feel like we have answers, we might tend to just talk because we're uncomfortable with it. And this is where courage and communication start to play out together. We have to balance these. If we just focus on consideration, we tend to avoid conflict, or we tend to avoid the difficult conversations. And if we just focus on the courage piece, having the difficult conversations, we tend to not build the relationships and the trust. And so there is this balance that we need to strike. And the balance is less about them being in equilibrium and more about us being intentional about which parts of that we're using, courage or consideration, in the dialogue. But as leaders are intentional about that, and they work on seeking first to understand, making sure they're hearing, and then fostering dialogue, that ability to balance courage and consideration goes up because you start to build an emotional bank account with your people. You start to develop a level of trust on your team, and it tears down some of the difficulty of balancing the courage and the consideration part so that we're our very best self as we lead. So much of what we do is communicating with our people, with our clients, with vendors. And it's a skill that we can develop rather than just go with what comes natural to us.
Mm-hmm. And Curtis, I know I've heard you use a framework called the Trust Framework. Can you explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, this is such an important and emerging capability with leaders. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, trust was thought of as a really soft, non-important thing. And it's become an economic driver in business. When trust is high, speed goes up and cost goes down. Think about that for a minute. If we have high trust with our team, the speed with which we want to do things goes up and the cost of doing it goes down. And the opposite of that is true as well. If we're not careful and we're careless or reckless about building trust in our team or our organization, then speed goes way, way, way down. We get resistance, we get pushback, we get challenge, we get people not being willing to follow our leadership. And as a result, cost goes up. So there is this really interesting, very simple equation that we love to talk about, where trust, speed, and cost all play essential parts in how we work as a leader and the outcomes we get.
Absolutely. Well, Curtis Bateman, I've really enjoyed this conversation. And something that I'm really passionate about is, as you said earlier in this conversation, all of these principles are true, whether you're a Fortune 100 company or you're just getting started in entrepreneurship. And for me, I'd say of those 3 C's, communication is really, really important. So I just want to ask you one final question over here of why is it important for everybody listening to this program to define your purpose and positive intent when engaging in an important conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's true for not just leaders, but individuals as well, to be clear about what is my end in mind, my purpose for this conversation. And by doing that, it allows us to align the conversation with our values and the outcomes that we want. And when we take the time to do that and to be intentional about it, it allows us to be better contributors, better leaders, and as a result, get better outcomes, right? We remove the ambiguity in the communication and we improve the quality of the outcomes we get. And that's just a magnificent opportunity for all of us when we're at work or in our personal life to improve the nature of our relationships through improved communication.
Excellent. Curtis Bateman, again, really appreciate you sharing your passion, your expertise from your perch at Franklin Covey. How can we get in touch with you and learn more about your important work and research?
Yeah, thank you. So franklincovey.com has glimpses into all of these topics we've talked about. And there's a lot there. There's white papers, there's articles, there's customer videos, information. So there's a lot you can get there. And if you'd like to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, just Curtis Bateman. You'll see it. I publish blogs and articles, a lot of it focused on change and communication. And I'd love to connect with people. I think we're constantly sharing new and exciting insights around those topics.
Fantastic. Curtis Bateman, thanks so much for joining us. We're going to squeeze in some headlines, commercials, quick breaks. When we come back, we've got a lot more small business jobs and entrepreneurship in store for you. Don't touch that dial. You are listening to Get Down to Business.